Pretty easy, I would think so. Properties. Properties of real numbers. Commutative property of addition. Commutative property says you can change the order. So if you look on the ALEKS program, they'll show you something like x plus y equals y plus x. I can switch the order of my adding and get the same answer. 2 plus 3 is the same thing as 3 plus 2. Associative property of addition. Associative, an association is a group, has to do with grouping symbols, parentheses. The order has to stay the same, the parentheses are what is moved or changed. So for the associative property, they'll show you something like x plus y plus z, where you have parentheses around two of them. I'm going to put them around the x and the y. On the other side, you'll still have x plus y plus z, but now your parentheses are going to be moved to around the second two instead of around the first two. So for the associative property, your order has to be exactly the same. The only thing that's different is you move the parentheses. Additive identity property. You want to think about the identity kind of like looking at the mirror. What you start with is what you want to be equal to. For addition, if you add 0 to something, it doesn't change its value. 3 plus 0 is still 3. So the additive identity property will say something like x plus 0 equals x. The whole key there is that you're adding 0 to something which doesn't change its value. Additive inverse property. The word inverse means opposite. The opposite of adding is subtracting. And so the additive inverse property says that if I add two numbers that are opposite, I get an answer of 0. Their example for additive inverse property would be something like x plus a negative x equals 0. 3 plus negative 3 is 0. If I add opposites, I get 0. The distributive property. Well, probably most of you know that the distributive property is used to get rid of the parentheses. They'll show you something like x times y plus z equals x times y plus x times z. They may or may not put the dot in there for times, but I will for effect. So I got rid of my parenthesis by multiplying the x times both terms in the parentheses. Commutative property of multiplication is going to look like the commutative property of addition. So be careful when you're picking that off your list that you're picking the correct one. Am I adding or multiplying? But basically I can change my order. So x times y is going to equal y times x. Again, you really don't need the dot there, but I'm going to put it in there so you remember I multiply. Same thing with associative property. It's going to look a lot like the associative property of addition, just that I'm multiplying. So x times y times z, where I have parentheses around the first two, is equal to x times y times z, where I have my parentheses around the second two. I've just moved my parentheses. Multiplicative identity property. You want to think about the identity property. What I start with is what I want to be equal to. So what do I multiply by so that I end up with the same number? Well, I would multiply by 1. 3 times 1 is still 3. So my multiplicative identity says if I take something times 1, I end up with that same number. X times 1 is still x. Multiplicative inverse. It's kind of the weird one. Inverse, we think of opposites. Normally when we think of an opposite of multiplying, we probably think dividing. They're going to think in terms of fractions. When I divide with fractions, I multiply by the reciprocal. So when I take a value times its reciprocal, I always get an answer of 1. So they're going to show you something like x times 1 over x equals 1. If I had 2/3 times 3 over 2, I get an answer of 1. A value times its reciprocal always equals 1. And the last one is the multiplication property of 0. If I take something times 0, hey, guess what? I get 0. So they're going to have you pick them out. On Alex, they're going to have a drop down and you pick which one it is. I'm just going to have you write down the number of which one it is. So here, obviously, this is an adding property, so it's one of your first four. If I have 3/5 plus n equals n plus 3/5, which property is that? Number one, the commutative property. I just switched them around, changed the order. The next one is a multiplying property, so that tells me it's 6 through 10. I have 8 times 4 times 5/4, and I changed it to 8 times 4 times 5/4. And what property is that?
Associative.
Associative property of multiplication. So that's number 7. The next one, 0 equals 2/3 times 0.
Multiplication property of 0.
Multiplication property of 0. I took something times 0 and I still ended up with 0. And then I have b times 1 over b equals 1.
Inverse.
Multiplicative inverse, so that would be number 9. So, there was all my scribbling. If you print out my note sheets, you'll have my notes on that. Or maybe you scribbled that all down, but we had 2 more to do. They just take up a lot of room. So, n times 3/5 equals 3/5 n. Did I go to the right one? Sometimes I skip pages. N times 3/5 equals 3/5 n would be which property? Commutative property of multiplication. So number 6, we just switch the order. They switch those 2 things around, right? The next one, a times c plus 2 equals ac plus a times 2. It's which property? Distributive. They took the a times the c, then the a times the 2. They got rid of their parentheses. So if one side has parentheses and the other doesn't, pretty good sign. That's my distributive property. 0 plus 2/3 equals 2/3. Additive identity. I added 0 to something which didn't change its value. That's number 3. And then 1/9 times 9 equals 1.
Multiplicative inverse.
Multiplicative inverse. That's number 9. Something times its reciprocal is equal to 1. So number 12 there. The first one would be what property?
Distributive.
Distributive. They took the 3/2 times both the 5 and times the 7. Got rid of their parentheses. So number 5. The next one would be
Associative property of multiplication.
associative property of multiplication, which is number 7. They just move the parentheses on that one. The next one, negative 5/2 plus 5/2 equals 0. Number 4, the additive inverse property. They added numbers that were opposite and got an answer of 0. And the last one, 1 times c equals c. Multiplicative identity property, number 8. 1 times anything doesn't change the value, right?